JK Strategies.
This is Jack Calvertinis, and welcome to another episode of Take 5. This is our chance to talk to DC area policymakers about key issues of the day. And today we're very excited to have Lori Reilly. Lori, welcome.
Thank you, Jack.
We're so proud to have you here today, Lori. I know you're a very proud Nebraska fan. I know football and basketball, this hasn't been the greatest year.
It has not.
Being a Wake Forest guy, we've had our years of not being so good, and for some reason this year we're actually on a roll.
Yeah.
I know our families, enjoy college sports, love Chick-fil-A, and on the more serious front, I'm very proud to say that you again have made the top lobbyist in DC list, as well as Washingtonians' most influential people in healthcare. So, kudos to you, and we're very happy to talk to you today about healthcare generally, but in particular, how the DC policy environment is impacting the industry as well as patients.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Lori, you've been at pharma now, it's 20 years, which is hard to believe. You started in the Bush administration. We're sitting here in year 2 of the Biden administration. You've seen a lot. You've seen the rollout of Part D. You've seen the creation of BARDA, which has helped us get through the creation of Operation Warp Speed and the vaccines. You've seen the rollout of Obamacare, the attempts to kill Obamacare, the Trump administration's proposals to lower drug prices, some of which you disagreed with, some of which you agreed with. How do you compare this challenge right now with what the administration and some in Congress are trying to get passed through the BBB with some of the challenges you've seen in the past? And what are really the repercussions that you see for the industry and patients?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jack. I think, the interesting thing I would say at this point in time, having this debate while we're in the middle of number one, a global pandemic, right, where the industry has been kind of front and center in terms of bringing vaccines to market and therapeutics to market, and combined with all of the other innovation that has been underway over the last decade or more in terms of oncology research, headway we're making in diseases like sickle cell and gene therapies, rare disease research. So I worry at times that there is this kind of disconnect that happens, that lawmakers believe that they can pass policies that would permit the government to set prices for medicines in this country, and that there's no impact if that were to happen. And I think it's hard to reconcile what that impact would be if you don't understand how pharmaceutical research and development works, right? So, on average, it takes 10 to 15 years to bring a concept of a medicine actually to the patient. It takes...
People have sorry to interrupt. People have no idea of that, how long it takes.
Absolutely.
And the cost
And the
of
cost,
doing that.
right. The cost is, $1.5 billion to bring a medicine to market. And the risk involved. And by risk, I mean, on average, about 90% of what companies enter into clinical trials at the FDA ends up not coming out the back end, right? So only 10% of what we actually put through a clinical trial will actually make its way to the patient. So if you are trying to convince an investor to come invest with us, I liken it sometimes to playing the lottery, right? People don't play the lottery to win back the $10 that they put in, right? They win back with a promise or potential that there may actually be a reward at the end of it. So when you diminish or take away the potential for the reward to happen, what's the incentive for an investor to invest in something that may take 10 to 15 years to prove its value, that has a 90% chance of failing, right? Especially when, investors don't have to invest in the biopharmaceutical industry, right?
They have options.
They have options, right? There's lots of them out there, including Snapchat and all sorts of other technology options where the returns are much quicker. So that...
And the investments are less, on the front end.
Absolutely. Lower investment, bigger potential reward. So, I will say that is not to diminish the fact that there are patients today that are struggling to access and afford their medicines. We understand that. We've tried and have come to the table with, I would argue, constructive solutions that, quite honestly, are bipartisan solutions. Unfortunately, the BBBA, which you raised, contains provisions that I worry will lead to significant impact, not just on access today to medicines patients are used to being able to access, but also future innovation. And, the unfortunate reality is people don't know what they haven't seen yet, right? And that's true in everything in life. But I think for many patients, they know today if there is not a therapy that is available to treat the condition they have or one of their loved ones have. And I lived through almost 10 years of caring for my mother who passed away from ALS several years ago. And there really, in my opinion, is no disease that is worse. To be trapped physically in your body but have your mind completely intact. To be 100% paralyzed on a ventilator but knowing everything that's happening to you. And unfortunately, we haven't made the kind of progress that I and every other person that has a loved one or is suffering from ALS hopes to make. But I believe that there is that potential because the science is advancing. And I want companies to have the incentive and be willing and able to take the risk to bring a medicine on the market that either delays its onset, hopefully one day cures it so that no other patient will have to live through what my mother lived through. But that's only possible if we have a public policy environment that actually nourishes entrepreneurship and risk-taking, that relies on markets to set prices, which I would say we actually do very effectively in this country. The problem is, and this is something that this bill does not address, the problem is there's middlemen in our system here. And unfortunately, the middlemen are responsible for about 50% of the price of a branded medicine today. Just to make that clear, the pharmaceutical industry receives less than half of the price of a brand name medicine when it gets sold.
No, people don't know it. I know you all have some ads. Yep. Actually, the one ad that I find the most effective, because this is something I learned a lot about when I was at HHS, is the one where you have the people in suits standing in the pharmacy, where they are about to receive what it is that the patients at the counter ought to be receiving back in terms of these rebates that are going in other directions.
Absolutely.
So I know that's a place where we were aligned when I was in government, and yet some of these proposals are actually eliminating the very progress and the bipartisan progress that was made.
Yes. On a positive note, I think there's an increasing awareness among lawmakers that something isn't right in the system when a pharmacy benefit manager that most people have never heard of is able to negotiate on behalf of the patient, but not share the fruits of that negotiation with the patient that they're negotiating on behalf of. So medicines like diabetes medicines, where the rebates and discounts that our companies offer sometimes are 70, 75%, but a patient is paying the full list price. None of that is solved in this particular bill. And that's the kind of thing that we would love to see get resolved, that we actually take the fruits of competition that exist in our system today and share those with the patient who comes to the pharmacy counter and may not be able to afford their medicine today. So we believe a lot more needs to be done. We need to lower copays. We need to have rational deductibles so that people don't pay a premium all year long to get to November or December and finally feel like they have insurance. So there are things that can and should be done to lower cost to patients. We 100% agree with that. Unfortunately, a lot of those common sense bipartisan solutions were ignored in this bill in favor of government price setting.
Wow, that is quite a analysis of provisions that could very well, rear their head again.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate that. So that sounds to me like, if I were to predict, that would probably be at the top of your list of looking at 2022.
Absolutely.
What other challenges, and then we'll shift to really opportunities. What other challenges do you see this year?
Yeah, and maybe connected to that is, the polarization that I think we all see and feel in Washington. With regards to our industry and patients' needs to have some of their affordability challenges met, there actually are bipartisan agreement in a number of areas. Having an out-of-pocket maximum in Medicare Part D that so every senior knows from year one, I'm never going to have to spend more than $2,000 in my entire year on medicines. Seniors, they live on a fixed income, most of them. Having that certainty and predictability is really important, and it's an area of bipartisan agreement. But I think the polarization that exists, particularly in an election year, it makes that challenging, unfortunately. So that is one of the challenges, just the sheer polarization that exists.
Because it sounds like that kind of bill, if that was a provision that was either in standalone or in there, you'd have unanimity between the parties, but maybe not unanimity, but a bipartisan consensus with also the industry and patient groups.
Absolutely. And that provision,
providers.
On a positive note, I will say they included an out-of-pocket maximum in the bill. Unfortunately, they also included a lot of other provisions that I think make us and many other groups nervous with regards to patients. We're for a pro-patient bill that addresses some of the bad incentives in the system, that gets costs lowered to patients, but not at the expense of patient access and certainly not at the expense of future innovation for patients. So polarization is one.
Okay.
The other one I would say is the pandemic, quite honestly. Our industry has been hard at work since the start of this pandemic, again, developing vaccines, developing therapeutics. But it's a virus, and viruses change and they mutate, and we see new variants. And industry is always trying to stay one step ahead of where this pandemic goes. And it's obviously, challenging not just in the US, but across the globe. And a lot of our efforts, too, are how do we ensure patients all across the world have access to the vaccines that our companies make, to the therapeutics that they make too. But that is, for lots of reasons, supply chain issues, access, that is a challenge that I think we'll continue to have to try and overcome this year.
On the therapeutic side, and this is something that has, bothered me and have talked about it a little bit, but, in past pandemic planning efforts, it always was about how can governments quickly develop, as quickly as possible, both therapeutics and vaccines? And yet, in spite of the incredible progress, whether it's the monoclonal antibodies, whether it's the recent Pfizer drug, Merck drug, there seems to be, by certain policymakers, almost a diminishing of the importance of therapeutics for us to save lives, improve lives, and get past this pandemic. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that, because they certainly are important, but not always mentioned as often and frequently as these life-saving vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Quite honestly, there's really three legs of that stool. There's all of the washing your hands and being safe part of the stool that's important for prevention. There's vaccines that prevent, hopefully, at least hospitalization and death associated with COVID. And to your point, there's also therapeutics that companies have invented. You mentioned monoclonal antibodies as well as the new antivirals, which are really geared towards people who ultimately succumb to having COVID, whether they were vaccinated or not. Yes. And these are a really important part of the treatment arsenal that to your point, are absolutely important. You want both. One alone may not be sufficient, so we want to have as many options. And companies continue to research more therapeutics so that in the future, COVID may be like getting, your Z-Pack if you need it, and many of us have taken that if you come down.
Yes.
And hopefully we'll get to a point where we can treat these and manage COVID in the future, and companies continue, again, to both modify their vaccines, but also try and research new therapeutics as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So other things as you look towards this year and beyond that the industry is looking at?
Yeah, I would say, on a positive note, and I touched on this earlier, is the incredible science that we're seeing. The mRNA technology that many people have heard about in the context of a few of the vaccines, like the Pfizer vaccine that have been approved, that technology has actually, been studied and been in existence now for 2 decades. But companies are now looking at use of that technology for other conditions, be it oncology, autoimmune diseases. And I think that is going to hold such incredible potential for the future, right? As cell and gene therapies, again, we're seeing incredible potential advancements in conquering sickle cell disease. Again, several different types of cancer. So the state of innovation is really at an all-time high. So to me, that's an opportunity, and it's something that's worth fighting for and worth protecting. And then the other point, again, and I kind of addressed it earlier, is just around affordability. I do believe that we're finally making headway where people recognize the importance of ensuring that patients can access and afford their medicine. Keeps people out of the hospital, gives them a better quality of life. We know when patients have access and they're adherent to their therapy that oftentimes costs are lower. And so my hope is that we will get past, hopefully, some of the polarization that exists, and we can work on some bipartisan solutions that actually, do a lot to address what patients pay at the counter without hurting the innovation and the innovation life cycle that so many patients are relying on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really a tour de force in terms of us understanding the landscape, what it is you all are looking at, and also how important it is that the legal, the business, the regulatory environment be in a positive, healthy place so that these innovations can continue in the future for all of us. So
Well
thank you,
said,
Lori.
Jack. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.